They say money can buy anything. Respect, security, even happiness if you can afford the price tag. But there's one thing money can never buy: the truth. And when the truth finally walks into your life, it doesn't always wear a suit or carry a briefcase. Sometimes it's wearing rubber gloves, holding a mop, and carrying the dignity of a queen. This is not a story about wealth. It's a story about worth. And it begins on the top floor of a tower built of glass, ego, and ambition. The headquarters of Orion Global, where every reflection shines like a mirror made of gold. The air up there smells like money. Every conversation sounds like a deal. And everyone, absolutely everyone, knows who runs it all. Adrian Cole, 36 years old, billionaire, ruthless, brilliant. The kind of man who measures life in productivity charts and profit margins. He doesn't believe in luck. He believes in control. And control is something he never loses, at least not until today. It was supposed to be a regular morning, a board meeting, a presentation, another day of dominance. But when the courier dropped off a sealed envelope from Europe, everything changed. Adrian tore it open with irritation. Inside, 3 pages written in an old European language he couldn't identify. He scanned the room full of executives. "Anyone know what this is?" Silence. "Basque," murmured someone, uncertain. "Basque," Adrian repeated, his brows furrowing. He turned to his assistant. "Get me a translator, immediately." "I already tried, sir," she said nervously. "No one's available." "Not today." Adrian's patience snapped. He slammed the folder on the table so hard it echoed through the room. 100 employees, an entire international company, and no one can translate a few stupid pages? He started pacing, the fury boiling inside him. Then, half in anger and half in mockery, he shouted, "Fine, I'll make it worth someone's while. Whoever translates this letter for me, I'll give them my full month's salary." A shocked murmur rippled through the room. $150,000. The number hung in the air like electricity. Everyone stared. No one spoke. Because it wasn't a real offer. It was an insult. A statement of superiority from a man who believed no one could ever surprise him. But then a quiet voice came from the back of the room. "I can translate it." For a moment, no one moved. Heads turned. Near the water cooler stood a woman in a light blue cleaning uniform, a mop in one hand and a bucket beside her. Her name was Eliza Torres, a janitor, a ghost in the building, someone who existed only when floors needed shining. She spoke again, calmly. "I can translate it, Mr. Cole." The room erupted in laughter. Some shook their heads. Others exchanged looks that said, "She's lost her mind." Adrian turned, narrowing his eyes. "Excuse me?" "Those papers," she said. "They're in Basque. I understand it." He scoffed. "You expect me to believe that a cleaning lady can read Basque?" "I expect you," she replied, "to let me try." The way she said it, quiet but firm, stopped the laughter. Curiosity flickered in Adrian's eyes. Something about her voice didn't tremble like others. It carried a strange confidence, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. "Fine," he said coldly, tossing the papers her way. "Amuse me." Eliza caught the documents neatly, straightened the creased pages, and began to read. The room fell silent. So silent you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. Her lips moved quickly. Her eyes scanned the lines with precision. Then she looked up. "This is a notice of inheritance," she said evenly. "A woman named Inez Cole passed away a month ago. She was your great-aunt on your mother's side. She's left you property in a substantial estate in Bilbao." Adrian froze. A few people gasped. Eliza continued. "The deadline to claim it expires today at 5 p.m. Mariana, the assistant, checked her watch. 3:03 p.m. Panic flickered across Adrian's face. "That's impossible," he muttered. "This has to be a scam." But his gut told him otherwise. He grabbed the phone, called the Spanish consulate, and read out the sender's name and reference number. While everyone waited, the tension in the room felt suffocating. Finally, Adrian lowered the phone slowly, his face pale. "It's real," he said quietly. "Every word of it." The executives exchanged stunned glances. For the first time in his career, Adrian Cole didn't know what to say. Eliza spoke again. calm as ever. If you'd like, I can prepare your acceptance document, but we'll have to hurry. He nodded slowly. Do it. You'll have everything you need. Mariana escorted her upstairs to his office. Before Eliza left, Adrian called out, Wait, I'll pay you. Name your price. Just the amount you promised, she replied. My salary? $150,000? Exactly. You could hear the collective gasp, but Eliza didn't blink. She wasn't joking. She wasn't even smiling. He studied her face. No greed, no fear, just quiet certainty. Then with a strange respect, he wrote the check and handed it to her. You really remember everything, don't you? He said softly. People say a lot of things, she replied, especially when they think the cleaning staff isn't listening. And with that, she turned and walked away. The entire room stayed frozen. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, and in that silence, something inside Adrian shifted. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. The image of the woman in the blue uniform haunted him. He kept replaying her voice, her composure, her eyes that held no fear even when surrounded by mockery. Who was she? Where did she learn Basque? Why did she look more like a diplomat than a janitor? He didn't know it yet, but the next time he saw Eliza Torres, she would save far more than just a forgotten inheritance. She would save the one thing he didn't even realize he'd lost: his humanity. This is The Cleaning Lady Who Outsmarted the Millionaire. A story about power, prejudice, and the price of underestimating someone. A reminder that intelligence doesn't always wear a suit and strength doesn't always speak loudly. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the truth that could change everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge the heart, stir the soul, and remind us that value isn't measured in dollars, but in courage. Leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from, and at the end, rate this story from 0 to 10. Your simple comment helps these stories reach more people who still believe in decency, empathy, and redemption. Now sit back, take a deep breath, and enjoy the story. Because today the janitor is about to teach the billionaire that sometimes the richest soul in the room is the one holding the mop. That night, sleep refused to come for Adrian Cole. The city outside his penthouse glittered like 1,000 promises, bright, perfect, and unreachable. But no matter how many lights burned across Chicago, they couldn't silence the voice that haunted him. Her voice, calm, steady, unafraid. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, Eliza Torres, the cleaning lady who had stepped out of nowhere, faced a room full of executives, and translated a language almost extinct, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. She hadn't asked for mercy. She hadn't even flinched under his tone. She just stood there, poised, composed, like she belonged in that boardroom more than anyone else. For a man used to control, that calm terrified him. When he had spent years surrounded by yes men, people who spoke only when spoken to. But this woman, she didn't follow his rhythm. She created her own. By dawn, Adrian was dressed in a crisp navy suit, tie slightly loosened, eyes sharp but sleepless. His driver offered him coffee. He waved it off. Instead of heading to the 40th floor, where deals worth millions waited, he pressed the elevator button for the basement. When the doors slid open, a faint scent of disinfectant and lemon greeted him. The world down there felt different, quieter, smaller, too honest for someone who usually lived above the clouds. Rows of metal shelves lined the room, stacked with cleaning supplies, buckets, gloves, bottles of chemical solutions. Everything sterile and labeled. And in the middle of it all, like a conductor of quiet chaos, was Eliza. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied in that same messy bun. She was sorting cleaning products by category: bleach, detergent, sanitizer, aligning every bottle like a perfectionist. For a moment, Adrian just watched. There was something mesmerizing about her focus, the way she paid attention to details most people never even noticed. It was the same precision he demanded from his top managers. Except she wasn't doing it for praise or approval. She did it because order to her seemed like dignity. He cleared his throat softly. Eliza. She turned, startled but not intimidated. Mr. Cole? He nodded. I wanted to talk. Her brow furrowed. Is there a problem with yesterday's translation? No, he said quickly. Quite the opposite. He took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. Not a skill he was used to. You were extraordinary. She blinked as if unsure whether that was a compliment or a setup for something else. Thank you, but I was just doing what anyone would. No, he said quietly. No one else could have done it. Silence filled the room. The hum of the air vent seemed suddenly loud. Finally, he spoke again. I have a proposal. Her eyes narrowed slightly. A proposal? He nodded, stepping closer, but keeping a respectful distance. I want to hire you, not as cleaning staff, as a freelance translator for Orion Global. We work with international clients all the time. I could use someone with your abilities. Eliza set the bottle she was holding onto the shelf slowly, turning to face him fully. Her expression didn't change much, but her voice carried a trace of disbelief. A translator? You want me to work for you? Yes, he said simply. On your terms. You'll keep your current job if you want. Whenever we have foreign contracts or negotiations, I'll call you in. You'll be paid per project. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then crossing her arms, she said, And what's the condition? Condition? There's always a condition with people like you, Mr. Cole. He almost smiled at her directness. The only condition is that you say yes. No humiliation, no charity, no patting me on the back because it makes you feel generous. Her tone was razor sharp, her posture unyielding. Adrian hesitated. Then for the first time in years, he softened. Deal. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of something neither of them could fully name. He expected her to smile. She didn't. Instead, she nodded once, turned back to her shelf, and began working again. Adrian stood there awkwardly, unsure whether to leave or say something else. You know, he muttered after a pause, people don't usually talk to me that way. Without looking up, she replied, Maybe that's the problem. That hit harder than she probably meant it to. He chuckled under his breath, not out of amusement, but out of realization. You're not afraid of me, are you? She finally turned, meeting his gaze squarely. Should I be? Her eyes didn't waver. There was no defiance, just a quiet certainty that disarmed him completely. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. No, I suppose you shouldn't. When he left the basement, he felt something strange, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't attraction. It was humility. Later that morning, back in his office, Adrian couldn't focus on a single report. Mariana, his assistant, noticed him staring at his computer screen. Untouched coffee growing cold beside him. Sir, the meeting with the Japanese clients. Reschedule it, he interrupted. Again? Just do it. She hesitated. Is this about the cleaning lady? He glanced up sharply. What did you say? Nothing, sir. It's just, everyone's talking. You brought her to your office yesterday. They're curious. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Rumors spread faster than truth in his world, and yet a part of him didn't care, because for once, curiosity wasn't a weakness. It was necessary. By the end of the week, Eliza received her first assignment, translating a series of emails from a Spanish client. Adrian personally handed her the documents, a gesture unheard of for someone in his position. You'll be paid double your hourly rate, he said. She looked at the papers, then back at him. I didn't ask for a favor. It's not a favor, he replied. It's fair compensation. For someone like me? He frowned. For someone like you who saved my company from losing a fortune? A flicker of emotion crossed her face, something between surprise and gratitude. But she quickly masked it. I'll have it done by Monday. You'll have all weekend, he said softly. Then you'll have it tomorrow. And she did. Monday morning, he found the translation on his desk. Perfect, thorough, and annotated with notes about cultural nuances even professionals often missed. It was better than he expected, better than anything he'd seen. He called her in. When she entered his office, She didn't look nervous, just alert, ready to defend her work if needed. He gestured to the papers. Flawless. Thank you. You didn't just translate. You interpreted context, intent, tone. Where did you learn to do that? Her answer was simple. Listening. You learn a lot when no one thinks you're paying attention. That line lingered in his mind long after she left. Days passed, weeks even, and every time she came in for a translation, Adrian found himself inventing reasons to keep her around longer. He'd ask unnecessary questions about phrasing, tone, cultural idioms, anything just to hear her voice, to watch how her mind worked. Eliza, of course, saw through it. You don't actually need me to explain these things, she said one day, not even looking up from her laptop. Maybe I just like having you around, he replied without thinking. That made her stop typing. Careful, Mr. Cole, she said quietly. You sound almost human. He laughed. A real laugh, not the corporate kind he used in meetings. Don't tell anyone. It might ruin my reputation. For the first time, she smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but genuine. What Adrian didn't realize was that in offering her that freelance position, he hadn't just hired a translator. He'd invited a mirror into his world. Every time he saw her, working, thinking, standing tall despite the odds, she reminded him of everything he'd forgotten about himself. Respect, integrity, the value of effort without applause. And though neither of them would admit it, something had shifted. In a basement full of cleaning supplies and fluorescent lights, a CEO and a janitor had shaken hands and unknowingly changed the course of each other's lives. By Monday morning, the building was already buzzing. The 10th floor conference room of Orion Global looked like a small battlefield of egos. Laptops open, papers scattered, translators whispering rehearsed phrases before the French delegation arrived. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a $20 million import contract, months in negotiation, and Adrian Cole wanted perfection. He had brought in two of the company's official translators, high-paid experts, both fluent, both confident, both about to be humbled. Eliza Torres had been invited as support. That was the word they used, support, like she was a spare tire in case the professionals got a flat. She didn't mind. She sat quietly near the corner, notebook in hand, hair tied back, blending into the beige walls. But Adrian noticed her the moment she walked in. There was something about the way she carried herself, humble yet centered, as if she'd already accepted that the world would underestimate her and learned how to use that. He didn't say a word, only gave her a brief nod. She nodded back, just as calm. The French clients arrived precisely at 10 a.m. 3 men in tailored suits, their accents smooth, their eyes scanning the room like predators, sizing up prey. James, the senior translator, started the introductions. His voice was polished, his posture rehearsed. Welcome to Orion Global, gentlemen. Mr. Cole sends his regards. Adrian walked in at that very second, every inch of him radiating authority. The room seemed to straighten itself automatically. Let's begin, he said simply. For the next 30 minutes, the meeting flowed like a scripted play. Numbers, charts, PowerPoints. Everything was going fine, until the lead French delegate leaned forward and asked a long, detailed question. James translated confidently. He's asking about ISO certifications for our manufacturing process? Adrian started to answer. When he noticed Eliza lift her head slightly, her pen stopped moving. She cleared her throat gently. Actually, she said softly, that's not what he asked. The room froze. James looked at her, annoyance flickering in his eyes. Excuse me? Eliza met his gaze, polite but firm. He didn't mention ISO. He asked about product origin, traceability, and environmental compliance, specifically whether Orion can prove ethical sourcing. A faint smile appeared on the French client's face. Exactly, he said, switching to English. Merci, madame. A low hum of surprise spread around the table. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her. James swallowed hard. Well, perhaps I misunderstood the accent, he muttered. Perhaps, Eliza replied calmly, returning to her notes. The conversation moved on, but the energy in the room had shifted. 15 minutes later, it happened again. Another client asked a technical question about contract timelines. James stumbled, giving an awkward summary. Eliza, still gentle, interjected, "He's asking whether the delivery clause includes customs clearance or if it ends at port arrival." The client nodded approvingly. "Très bien, madame." The second translator, Martha, looked down, embarrassed. Adrian, watching from the end of the table, couldn't hide a small smile. Not the smirk of superiority he usually wore, but something softer. Amusement, admiration, maybe even pride. For the rest of the meeting, Eliza handled every nuance flawlessly. She didn't dominate. She didn't boast. She simply filled the silence when it mattered most. When the French team left, shaking hands enthusiastically, one of them said, "You are lucky to have her, Mr. Cole. Très intelligente." Adrian's smile widened. "I know." The moment the door closed, James exploded. "Sir, I don't think it's appropriate for a janitor to correct official staff in front of clients." The room went still again, this time for the wrong reasons. Eliza started gathering her papers, preparing to leave. But Adrian spoke first. "James, sit down." His tone was calm, but it carried the kind of authority that sliced through ego like a scalpel. James hesitated, then sank back into his chair. Adrian turned to Eliza. "Can you stay for a minute?" She nodded once. When the others left, the silence stretched between them. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking out over the city. "You made me proud in there," he said finally. Eliza looked surprised. "That wasn't my intention." "Maybe not, but you did." He turned, meeting her eyes. "Where did you learn French that well?" "Spain, and Geneva for a while." He raised an eyebrow. "Geneva? As in the diplomatic circles?" "Something like that," she replied vaguely. She clearly didn't want to talk about her past, and he didn't push. Instead, he just nodded. "Well, whatever it was, it made a difference today." "That's what you pay me for," she said. "No," he said quietly. "I pay for words. You gave me credibility." For a moment, their eyes held. There was a weight there neither of them understood yet. That evening, back in her small apartment, Eliza replayed the meeting in her mind. She'd faced bigger rooms before. Ministers, diplomats, men with too much power and too little patience. But something about this morning had felt different. Maybe because for the first time in years, she'd spoken without fear of consequence. Her son Liam was coloring at the kitchen table. "How was work, Mom?" he asked without looking up. She smiled faintly. "Good. I think I finally made a little noise." "You're not supposed to make noise," he said innocently. "You always tell me to be quiet." She laughed softly. "You're right. Maybe sometimes it's okay to speak up." Meanwhile, Adrian was still in his office long after everyone had gone home. The city lights flickered below like a restless heartbeat. He poured himself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. He was thinking about her again. How she had dismantled arrogance with a single sentence. How she'd handled disrespect with grace. And how, for the first time, he'd felt small in the best possible way. He'd spent years building walls of authority. Walls that kept him powerful, but alone. And then one ordinary woman with a mop had walked in and, without even trying, reminded him what humility looked like. He smiled to himself. "Eliza Torres," he murmured. "Who exactly are you?" The next morning, gossip spread through the company like wildfire. Employees whispered in hallways. The cleaning lady corrected the senior translator in French in front of clients, and the CEO defended her. By lunchtime, everyone had an opinion. Some admired her, some resented her. But one thing was certain, no one dared look at her the same way again. Eliza felt the shift immediately. People greeted her with forced politeness, some with awkward smiles. It didn't bother her. She'd learned long ago that respect born of fear wasn't real respect. When she walked past Adrian's office, he looked up and nodded again. It wasn't the nod of a boss to an employee. It was the silent acknowledgement between equals. That afternoon, she returned to the basement to finish her cleaning duties. As she was refilling her mop bucket, she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You're supposed to be upstairs," she said. "And you're supposed to be off duty," Adrian replied. She turned then, half smiling. Old habits. Like being brilliant? She chuckled softly. Like working twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. He leaned against the doorway, hands in pockets. You shouldn't have to. Maybe not. But we live in a world where perception pays the bills. He studied her for a long moment. I don't think I've ever met anyone who made me question my own perception this much. Then maybe you're finally seeing people instead of profiles. He smiled. You know, that's twice in 2 days you've made me speechless. Most people can't even do it once. Then you need to talk to different people. She picked up her mop again, ending the conversation with quiet grace. He didn't stop her, because deep down, he knew. The more he tried to understand her, the more she would challenge him to understand himself. That night, as the lights of Orion Global dimmed and the corridors emptied, one truth lingered in Adrian's mind. In a world full of loud voices and louder egos, it had taken one soft-spoken cleaning lady to make an entire room fall silent. Something changed in Adrian Cole after that meeting with the French clients. He wouldn't admit it aloud, not to his assistant, not even to himself, but the truth was impossible to ignore. He found himself watching Eliza Torres more closely, not in the way a man watches a woman, but the way someone studies a mystery that refuses to be solved. There was something about her rhythm, steady, precise, almost mathematical. She wasn't late, ever. Every morning, 6:30 a.m. sharp, she walked through the glass doors of Orion Global. Same faded blue uniform, same calm stride, and when the clock struck 3:30 p.m., she left. No extra minutes, no wasted seconds. Adrian noticed she never joined the chatter by the elevators, never stayed for coffee breaks, no friends, no gossip. She came to work, did her job, and disappeared. If anyone had asked, they would have said she was invisible, but to him she had become impossible not to see. At first it was curiosity, harmless, or so he told himself. But soon curiosity turned into observation, observation into concern, concern into something he couldn't quite name. He started noticing the small things, how she sometimes pressed her fingers to her temple as if holding back a headache, how she'd smile faintly at the sight of kids running past the company's daycare center, and how every Friday afternoon she clutched a plain white envelope on her way out, her knuckles pale from gripping it too hard. One Friday, he finally decided to ask. He found her by the side exit, waiting for the bus, that same envelope in her hand. Eliza, he said softly. She turned, a little startled. Mr. Cole? You're still here? I was about to leave. You? Same, she replied. He nodded toward the envelope. That looks important. She hesitated. For a brief second, he saw something flash across her face, hesitation mixed with exhaustion. It is, she said finally. It's from the Children's Hospital. Someone you know? He asked carefully. She didn't answer at first. Then with quiet resolve, she said, my son, Liam. The way she said his name, soft, sacred, made Adrian freeze. He's 7, she continued. He has autism, occupational therapy, speech therapy, medication. All of it costs around $3,000 a month. Her voice didn't tremble. There was no self-pity, no plea for sympathy, just plain truth, stripped bare. That's why you never miss a day, he murmured. Exactly. Cleaning may not pay much, but it pays on time. She smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't. I can't afford to be late, not even once. They stood there in silence, the cold wind threading between them. Adrian's mind was racing. Calculations, logistics, the kind of numbers he usually used to fix problems. Except this wasn't a business equation. This was human. And Liam's father? He asked before he could stop himself. Her face changed, just slightly, a muscle tightening near her jaw. He left, she said simply. The day the doctor said autism, he decided he didn't want a defective child. Her words hit like a quiet storm. No anger, no tears, just the kind of calm that comes after too many disappointments. Adrian swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but there was nothing he could offer that wouldn't sound small. Finally, she looked up at him. Don't look at me like that, Mr. Cole. I don't need pity. That's not what this is, he said quietly. Then what is it? He hesitated. Respect. She blinked, surprised, then gave a small nod. Respect is nice, she said, but it doesn't pay hospital bills. For days afterward, her words followed him everywhere. Through meetings, dinners, endless phone calls. He found himself thinking about that envelope whenever he saw her, imagining what it must be like to carry a life that depended on your every paycheck, to smile at work when your heart was breaking in private, to keep going, not because you're strong, but because you have no choice. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Cole, the man who measured everything in profit and loss, started seeing numbers differently. $3,000 a month. To him, that was dinner at a restaurant. To her, it was survival. One morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. Eliza was already there, polishing the lobby floor, earbuds in, humming softly. He stood by the window, watching the reflection of the sunrise across the marble floor. For once, he didn't see her as an employee. He saw her as a mother fighting a quiet war no one else could see. He approached. "Good morning." She pulled out one earbud, startled. "Mr. Cole, you're here early. So are you." "Old habit," he smiled faintly. "I was thinking about what you told me. About Liam. About strength." She paused, unsure what to say. "You know," he continued, "most people talk about courage like it's loud. About speeches, victories, big moments. But I think courage looks more like this." He gestured to her. "The mop, the gloves, the quiet discipline. Showing up every day when life gives you every reason not to." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "You romanticize it. It's not courage, Mr. Cole. It's survival." "Maybe," he said, "but survival requires courage too." For a long moment, they just stood there, two people from opposite worlds, sharing a silence that felt strangely like understanding. Later that week, Adrian was in a meeting with his department heads when he caught sight of Eliza through the glass wall. She was speaking with a delivery clerk, helping him sign paperwork, calm, efficient, focused. No one paid her any attention, but to Adrian, it was like watching the only person in the building who still remembered what humanity looked like. His CFO, James, noticed his distracted stare. "Sir, something wrong?" "Nothing," Adrian said quickly. "Just realizing how blind we can be to the people who keep this place running." James looked confused. Adrian didn't explain. That evening, he did something unusual. He took a detour on his way home, through the industrial district of Pilsen, where Eliza lived. Her house was small, paint peeling, but the porch light glowed warmly. He sat in his car across the street, feeling ridiculous, yet unable to drive away. Through the window, he saw her and Liam at the kitchen table. The boy's dark hair was messy, his movements restless but full of life. Eliza leaned over, helping him color a picture. When he finally smiled, she laughed, a sound Adrian had never heard before. For the first time in a long while, the noise inside his head went quiet. No deals, no numbers, no chaos. Just the sight of a mother and her son, a picture of love carved out of hardship. He realized something then. She didn't need rescuing. She didn't need saving. She already had everything that mattered. Love, purpose, dignity. And him? He wasn't sure he had any of those things. Back at his penthouse, Adrian stood by the window, looking out at the endless city lights. He'd always believed success was about climbing higher, faster, farther. But maybe true success wasn't about reaching the top. Maybe it was about remembering the people who never had the chance to leave the ground. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. All he could see was Eliza's steady hands guiding her son's, helping him stay inside the lines, teaching him to build something beautiful out of imperfection. He whispered to himself, "She's stronger than any of us." The next day, he crossed paths with her in the hallway. She gave him a polite nod as always, but this time he stopped her. "Eliza," she turned. "Yes, Mr. Cole. If you ever need anything for Liam, medication, school, therapy, anything, you come to me." Her expression hardened slightly. "I appreciate it, but I don't need charity." It's not charity. Then what is it? He hesitated. Fairness. Her eyes softened, but her tone stayed professional. Then let's keep things fair. I work, you pay. That's enough. She gave a small smile, the kind that was both polite and final, and walked away. Adrian watched her go, realizing she had drawn a boundary, and he respected it, because for the first time, he wasn't looking at her as someone beneath him. He was looking at her as someone he could learn from. In a world obsessed with status, sometimes the greatest power lies in humility. Adrian Cole thought he was helping a struggling woman, but what he didn't know was that she was the one quietly saving him, teaching him that strength isn't measured in millions, but in the love that keeps you standing when everything else falls apart. It started as curiosity, but curiosity has a way of growing teeth, of turning into obsession when it meets mystery. For weeks after learning about her son, Adrian Cole couldn't stop thinking about Eliza Torres. Something didn't add up. She wasn't like the others who worked in the basement of Orion Global. People beaten down by routine, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. Eliza carried herself differently. There was precision in every movement, order in every word, and an intelligence that seemed too big for the life she was living. He had seen it before, in boardrooms and negotiations with world leaders, in people who knew exactly what to say and when to say it, but never in a janitor. She didn't just understand words. She understood language itself. The way people spoke, what they really meant, how silence sometimes said more than speech. That was something you didn't learn in a night school or an online course. That was training, discipline, education, and Adrian Cole couldn't let it go. One Thursday morning, while reviewing client contracts, he found himself unable to focus. His assistant, Mariana, noticed the distraction. He was staring out the window, not at the skyline, but at something far away, invisible. When she asked if he was all right, he simply said, "Find me everything you can on Eliza Torres." Mariana blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. "Sir, you mean the translator? Or the cleaning lady?" "Both," he replied, his tone sharp, decisive. That afternoon, Mariana placed a thin folder on his desk. At first it looked ordinary. Basic HR data, employment history, tax forms. But tucked in the back was something different. A resume that didn't belong in a maintenance file. Northwestern University, Masters in Linguistics, magna cum laude, diplomatic interpreter, U.S. Consulate, Barcelona, Spain. For a moment, Adrian forgot to breathe. He turned each page slowly, like reading a secret she had meant to bury. There were records of international conferences, certificates of security clearance, and glowing letters of recommendation signed by diplomats. Eliza Torres had once translated for ambassadors. She had stood in rooms where treaties were drafted, where billion-dollar deals were signed. And then, nothing. 2 years missing. No record of employment, no address. Then suddenly, 5 years ago, she appeared on Orion Global's payroll as a cleaning staff. The same year her son Liam was born, the realization hit like a blow. She hadn't fallen. She had vanished. Voluntarily or not, something had erased her. A woman too brilliant to just end up polishing floors. Adrian sat in silence, staring at the folder. The hum of the office faded. Outside his window, the city looked colder than usual. He thought about her, about that night she stood in his boardroom, calm under laughter, translating Basque like it was child's play, about the way she deflected questions about her past, about the light in her eyes when she talked about her son. She had built walls higher than any corporate tower he'd ever owned. But now, for the first time, he could see a glimpse of what lay behind them. Not poverty, not tragedy, but brilliance buried alive. And he couldn't stop asking himself one question: why? Why would a woman like her walk away from a life most people would kill for? What kind of pain makes a mind like that choose silence over recognition? He spent the next few days wrestling with it. Part of him wanted to confront her, to tell her he knew. Another part knew better. People like Eliza didn't hide because they were ashamed. They hid because the world had given them a reason to. Still, he needed to understand. Not out of pity, but because something in him, Something long dead had started to wake up. It was empathy, the one thing money had stolen from him years ago. Friday afternoon came quietly. The building was nearly empty when he walked down to the basement again. The scent of lemon cleaner filled the air. Eliza was there, mopping the floor, the steady rhythm of her movements almost meditative. For a moment, he just watched. How natural it looked, how out of place it felt. She shouldn't have been there, not someone like her. He imagined her standing at a podium, speaking 6 languages fluently, commanding rooms filled with politicians and CEOs, not crouching on a concrete floor, scrubbing someone else's footprints. He wanted to tell her what he'd learned. He wanted to ask her how she'd gone from interpreting diplomacy to cleaning offices. But he couldn't. Not yet. Because the truth he'd uncovered didn't belong to him. It was hers. That night, Adrian stayed late again. He opened the file one more time, reading every line until the paper edges grew soft. He found a scanned image, her consulate ID photo. Younger, confident, radiant. Her hair was shorter, her eyes sharper, her posture straight as if she believed the world could still be fair. He couldn't reconcile that woman with the one who now carried buckets of water through his hallways. It was like watching a symphony reduced to background noise. And yet somehow that quiet version of her still had more dignity than anyone he'd ever met. Over the weekend, he met with an old acquaintance, a trade attaché from the Department of Commerce. Over coffee, he brought up her name casually, as if it were a passing curiosity. The man's eyebrows lifted. Eliza Torres, the interpreter? She disappeared years ago. Brilliant mind. Some say she was blacklisted after an internal dispute in Spain. Others say she just quit. No one really knows. Blacklisted? Adrian asked. Maybe. There were rumors she knew too much about a few corporate negotiations. People who wanted her silence. But it's all gossip now. Why do you ask? Adrian just shook his head. Just an employee I'm trying to understand. But the attaché's words echoed long after he left. She knew too much. When Monday came, Eliza arrived as usual. 6:30 sharp, calm, precise. But Adrian wasn't looking at her the same way anymore. He saw not just the cleaning uniform, but the weight of the past stitched into every movement. She didn't know he'd learned the truth, and he didn't tell her. Instead, he watched. The way she organized, the way she spoke, the way she carried quiet authority in a world that refused to notice. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Cole, billionaire, CEO, master of control, realized how small he was standing next to a woman who had lost everything yet still refused to crumble. That afternoon, a client called unexpectedly from Madrid. The conversation turned tense. Language barriers, legal confusion. Mariana panicked, looking for translators. Adrian simply said, "Call Eliza." Within minutes, she was in his office. Calm, composed, as always. She listened to the conversation, switching between English, Spanish, and Catalan effortlessly, bridging communication like a conductor guiding an orchestra. When the call ended, the client's tone had changed from frustration to admiration. Mariana looked at her in awe. "Where did you learn to do that?" Eliza only smiled faintly. "It's like music. You just have to hear the rhythm." Adrian watched in silence, the respect in his eyes undeniable. He finally understood what he'd been feeling all along. Not curiosity, not attraction, reverence. Because sometimes you don't meet people, you witness them. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Adrian stood by his office window, the folder still open on his desk. He thought about how many times he'd judged people by their titles, their resumes, their worth to the company. And yet, here was a woman who had walked away from every title, every recognition, and still carried herself with more integrity than any executive he'd ever known. He wondered what she'd think if she knew he'd gone digging into her past. Would she be angry? Would she walk away? Or would she simply say, "Now you know why I chose silence"? He didn't have the answer. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever had broken her once, he would not be the one to break her again. Sometimes the brightest minds hide in the darkest corners, not because they failed, but because the world failed them first. Adrian Cole thought he was searching for answers, but what he really found was a mirror, one that showed him the emptiness of power without compassion and the quiet genius of a woman who had lost everything yet kept her dignity intact. There are moments that don't seem important when they begin. A simple invitation, a dinner meant to say thank you, but sometimes one small gesture becomes the start of a storm that neither heart is ready for. For Adrian Cole, that evening began as nothing more than a business courtesy. At least that's what he told himself. Eliza Torres had helped secure 2 international contracts in less than a month. Her translations had saved his company hundreds of thousands of dollars in a potential PR disaster. And though she never asked for recognition, Adrian felt indebted. Not financially, but in a way he couldn't quite explain. So one morning, he asked if she would join him for dinner. As a professional thank you, she hesitated, her expression unreadable. When she finally agreed, she added one quiet condition. It's not a date, and I'll dress simply. He had nodded, pretending not to feel the strange sting behind those words. The restaurant he chose was one of Chicago's finest, a place where chandeliers hung like frozen rain and violins whispered between the tables. To him, it was familiar ground, the kind of place he could navigate with his eyes closed. But for Eliza, it was another world entirely. She arrived on time as always. A plain navy blue dress, no jewelry, no makeup, just the simplicity that had always defined her. And yet, when she stepped through the door, heads turned, not because she was extravagant, but because she carried herself with that rare kind of grace that no amount of wealth could buy. Adrian stood to greet her, his usual composure wavering for the first time in years. "You look—" He stopped himself. "You look perfect." She smiled faintly. "Perfect isn't really my thing, Mr. Cole." "Adrian," he corrected softly. "Just Adrian tonight." They sat near the window where the city lights painted the glass in gold and silver. The waiter approached with that polite arrogance reserved for the wealthy. But when he saw Eliza's simple attire, his tone shifted. Condescending, almost dismissive. "Perhaps, ma'am, you'd prefer to see our basic menu?" Adrian caught it immediately. The subtle sneer, the barely hidden smirk. Eliza, however, remained calm. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Water's fine for now." But Adrian felt the heat rise in his chest. He leaned forward, his voice cutting the air. "She'll have the chef's tasting menu. And bring your best wine. Now." The waiter stiffened, mumbling an apology before hurrying away. Around them, a few nearby guests exchanged glances, the quiet kind of judgment that money often gives permission for. Whispers followed. Who she was, why she was there, whether she belonged. Adrian saw it all, and for the first time he saw his own world through her eyes, the silent cruelty that hid behind polished manners and crystal glasses. Dinner began quietly. He tried to steer the conversation towards safe topics, work, languages, travel, but Eliza's answers were measured, deliberate, never revealing more than she intended. Still, he couldn't help noticing the small things, how she studied every detail around her, how she listened more than she spoke, how the candlelight reflected in her eyes when she smiled. And beneath all of it, there was something else, a sadness she wore like perfume, invisible, but impossible to ignore. He asked her, almost without thinking, "Do you ever miss what you used to do?" She looked at him for a long moment. "You mean when I wasn't invisible?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued softly. "I used to believe intelligence was a shield, that if you were good enough, educated enough, decent enough, the world would treat you fairly. But life doesn't care about fairness, Adrian. It only rewards those who can survive the unfair." Her words lingered between them like smoke. He realized suddenly that he had spent his entire life chasing success while she had been fighting simply to endure. By the time dessert arrived, the tension had softened into something quieter. Not romance, not friendship, but the fragile middle ground between two people learning to trust. Adrian found himself studying her hands, the way she held her fork, the faint scars on her knuckles, the signs of a life that had known work, not luxury. He wondered what it would feel like to hold those hands, then immediately scolded himself for thinking it, because this wasn't a date. It was supposed to be gratitude, nothing more. Yet gratitude, when mixed with admiration, becomes something dangerously close to longing. When the check came, she tried to pay for her share. He laughed gently. "You're not serious." "Dead serious," she said. "I don't like debts." "Then think of it as repayment for the translation you refused to charge full price for." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine, but this doesn't change anything." "What would you like it to change?" he asked quietly. Her eyes flicked up, sharp, steady. "Nothing." Outside, the night had turned cold. The streets shimmered with rain. Adrian offered to walk her to her car, but she shook her head. "I take the bus." "Not tonight," he said. "Let me at least drive you home." She hesitated, then agreed. The ride was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with everything left unsaid. When they reached her neighborhood, she asked him to stop a block early. He parked beneath a streetlight, the glow soft against the glass. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," he replied. For a moment, they just sat there, two worlds sharing the same stillness. And maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the months of admiration and unspoken connection. But when she turned to say goodnight, he leaned in, gently, instinctively, and kissed her. It was a brief, trembling kiss, hesitant at first, then real. And for a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then came the sting, sharp, fast, echoing in the air like thunder. She had slapped him. Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "You just turned me into a cliché," she said. "The poor woman kissed by her rich boss. The fantasy everyone loves to watch, and no one respects." He tried to speak, but she opened the door and stepped into the rain. "You don't get to romanticize my struggle, Adrian," she said, turning once before walking away. "And you don't get to confuse guilt for affection." Then she was gone. The rain swallowed her silhouette as quickly as it had appeared. Adrian sat there for a long time, the taste of regret sharper than the wine still on his lips. He had spent years negotiating deals, reading rooms, predicting outcomes. But he had misread this completely. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had proved her right. Because for all his intelligence and success, he still didn't understand what dignity truly meant to someone who'd had to fight for it every single day. That night, he drove aimlessly through the city, the streets blurred past in streaks of light and memory. He saw her face reflected in every passing window. The quiet strength, the honesty, the pain. He thought about all the times she'd spoken truth to power without fear, and how in one impulsive moment he had made her feel small again. For the first time in years, the man who owned everything felt utterly powerless. Back in his penthouse, Adrian stood before the massive glass wall overlooking downtown. The rain hadn't stopped. It tapped against the window like a reminder. Steady, relentless. He rested his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging the reflection. He saw himself, a man surrounded by success, yet emptier than ever. He whispered into the silence, "I'm sorry, Eliza, but apologies, like rain, lose their meaning when spoken too late. Some mistakes don't break things. They reveal how fragile they already were." Adrian Cole wanted to show gratitude. Instead, he showed arrogance. And in that single moment, he learned a truth the rich rarely admit. Respect can't be bought, and love doesn't grow where power casts its shadow. When power feels threatened, it doesn't shout. It whispers. And sometimes those whispers are far more dangerous than any open war. After the night of the disastrous kiss, Adrian Cole and Eliza Torres hadn't spoken. Days turned into a week, and their once unspoken rhythm was replaced by silence. He kept his distance out of guilt. She kept hers out of dignity. But while Adrian wrestled with remorse, others inside Orion Global saw an opportunity. To them, the situation wasn't about emotions. It was about control. And control in the corporate world is worth more than truth. The first whisper began in the executive lounge. James Thornton, the company's CFO, a man whose loyalty could be measured in profit margins, poured himself a glass of whiskey and said what the others had been thinking. Our CEO's obsession with a janitor is starting to make us look ridiculous. Across the table, Richard Vale, the COO, smirked. Not just ridiculous, dangerous. Clients talk, investors listen. We're a brand, not a charity. And then came Sandra Liu, head of HR. Elegant, composed, her words laced with poison wrapped in reason. He's emotional, distracted, and now people are gossiping that the cleaning lady is his companion. The men chuckled quietly, but behind those laughs was fear. Fear that the image of Orion Global, the pristine empire of order and authority, was starting to crack. We can't afford a scandal, Sandra continued, and we certainly can't afford for our CEO to look weak. Weak, that was the word that made them all nod. 2 days later, they met behind closed doors in the upper conference room. Blinds drawn, phones off. On the screen glowed a single name, Eliza Torres. James began. Her record's clean, but her story isn't. No references, no past for 2 years, no traceable reason for why she's here. Richard added, she's overstepped boundaries, undermined senior staff, and now she's apparently gotten too close to Cole. If the media catches wind, we're done. Sandra folded her hands neatly. Then we'll fix it quietly. No headlines, no confrontation, just restructuring. The word restructuring sounded clinical, the corporate equivalent of a guillotine. The decision was unanimous. By Friday, her position would be eliminated. Meanwhile, Eliza went about her days as if nothing was wrong. She sensed the shift, of course, the long glances, the sudden hush whenever she entered a room. But she had lived through worse. She had survived exile, humiliation, and the slow death of dreams. Office politics barely scratched her skin anymore. What she didn't know was that this time, the knife wasn't coming from her enemies. It was coming from the walls she had helped clean. The notice came on a Thursday afternoon, a plain white envelope left on her desk. Effective immediately, your services will no longer be required. Thank you for your contributions to Orion Global. No explanation, no conversation, just a signature, Sandra Liu, HR Director. Eliza read it once, then again. She didn't cry. She didn't even frown. Instead, she took a slow breath, folded the paper neatly, and placed it in her bag. There was nothing left to fight. Some battles weren't worth the scars. She gathered her things, a few notebooks, her old ID card, a mug that said, World's Okayest Translator. Then she walked through the glass corridors one last time. Every step echoed like a quiet rebellion, the sound of a woman refusing to be broken by systems that had already taken so much. Upstairs, Adrian was in a meeting when he noticed her name missing from a translation report. At first, he thought it was a clerical error, but when he checked the HR system, his blood ran cold. Termination, effective immediately, without his approval, without his signature. For a man known for calm calculation, Adrian's reaction was anything but composed. He stormed out of the meeting, his voice sharp and cold. Assistants scattered as he crossed the floor, heading straight to HR. He didn't knock. He slammed the door open. Sandra looked up, startled but collected. Mr. Cole, what the hell is this? He demanded, holding the termination letter. A necessary decision, she said evenly, for the company's reputation. You fired her? His voice rose. Without consulting me? With all due respect, your personal involvement compromised your judgment. Adrian's jaw tightened. Personal involvement? You brought her into client meetings, gave her assignments above her pay grade, and because she earned it, he cut in, because she's better than half the executives here. Sandra didn't flinch. Better isn't the point, sir. Optics are. Behind her calm tone was a single message. You may be the CEO, but we still control the narrative. Adrian turned and left before he said something he couldn't take back. He searched the office, but Eliza was already gone. Her desk was empty, her badge turned in. All that remained was the faint scent of citrus cleaner, her silent goodbye. He caught up with her outside just as she was about to cross the street. She turned when she heard his footsteps. Her face was calm, almost too calm. "I just found out," he said, breathless. "You're not leaving. I'll fix this." She shook her head slowly. "Don't, Adrian." "They had no right." "They had every right," she interrupted softly. "It's their company, their rules. I'm just collateral." "No," he said firmly. "You matter." Her eyes met his, tired, sad, unyielding. "Then respect my decision. Don't make me smaller by trying to save me." Those words landed like stones. She continued, "I've lived too long fighting to be seen. I don't need another man fighting for me. I just need to walk away on my own terms." He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, to undo everything. But one look at her face told him this was not a moment for power. It was a moment for grace. And so, for the first time, Adrian Cole, the man who had built empires, moved markets, and commanded respect from the world, simply nodded. "If you ever change your mind," he began. "I won't," she said gently, "but thank you." Then she walked away, into the sunlight, into freedom, into whatever waited beyond those glass walls. That night, Adrian sat in his office long after everyone had gone home. The lights of the city blurred against the window like distant stars. He replayed her words over and over. "I don't need to be saved. I need to be respected." He realized then how easy it was for men like him to confuse the two. Saving made him feel powerful. Respecting made him feel human. And for a man who had spent his life building an empire of power, humanity suddenly felt like the rarest currency of all. Down in the basement, the janitorial locker still held her name tag, E. Torres, taped to the door in fading ink. He stood there for a long moment, fingers tracing the edge of it, the silence heavy. He could rebuild companies, buy influence, rewrite headlines, but he couldn't replace integrity. He couldn't buy back what they had taken from her. Outside, a storm was brewing. Rain streaked down the glass walls like tears the building didn't deserve. Adrian whispered to himself, "You were right, Eliza. Respect is the only thing worth fighting for. Power without conscience builds empires that crumble from the inside." Adrian Cole learned that truth the hard way. When the quietest person in the room, the one he tried to protect, chose dignity over salvation. Because real strength isn't in being rescued. It's in knowing when to walk away with your head held high. When someone leaves your world, the first thing you notice isn't their absence, it's the silence they take with them. After Eliza Torres walked out of Orient Global, that silence filled every corner of Adrian Cole's life. It was there in the elevator rides that used to feel efficient, but now just felt empty. It echoed in meetings where her insight should have been. The clarity, the calm. Even the hallways felt different, as if the building itself knew it had lost its heart. But no one else cared. To them, she was just another name erased from payroll, another replaceable face in a company too rich to remember the people who cleaned its floors. To Adrian, though, she had become something more than an employee, something he couldn't name, only feel. And that feeling wouldn't let him rest. It started as guilt. Then it became curiosity, and finally something deeper, a need to understand the world she came from. So one evening when the city began to dim and the sky turned the color of rust, Adrian made a decision that no one at his level ever made. He left the glass tower and drove south, to Pilsen, a working-class neighborhood where rent was cheap, roofs leaked, and dreams had to fight to stay alive. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just drove, through streets lined with murals of saints and graffiti of protest, through alleys that smelled of old bread and gasoline. His car, sleek, black, and expensive, looked absurd there, like a king lost among his own people. But he didn't care. He parked a few houses down from an address he'd memorized from her file, a small home with chipped paint, a sagging porch, and a tiny garden overrun with wild grass. It wasn't pretty, but it was alive. Through the window he saw her, Eliza, sitting at a worn-out kitchen table under the soft light of a flickering bulb. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling around her face. Across from her sat Liam, her son. The boy was small, thin, with wide eyes that wandered the room as if collecting pieces of the world most people never noticed. Eliza was showing him picture cards. Animals, colors, words. Each time he pronounced one correctly, she smiled, kissed his forehead, and laughed. And for the first time, Adrian saw her smile without restraint. It was radiant, the kind of smile that came from a place wealth could never touch. He stayed there in the dark, watching from his car like a man peeking into a life that didn't belong to him. The house was quiet, modest, imperfect, but full of something his penthouse had never known: warmth. Hours passed, yet he didn't move. He watched her cook, read to her son, tuck him into bed, and sit by the window afterward, staring at the stars as if she were having a silent conversation with the universe. He wondered what she prayed for: peace, strength, hope, or maybe just another day she could afford to keep the lights on. And then it hit him. She didn't need him. He had spent his entire life believing that money could fix people, that generosity made him noble. But what he saw in that little house shattered that illusion. Eliza wasn't surviving because of anyone's help. She was surviving because she had built a life out of courage, piece by fragile piece. And the truth he didn't want to admit was brutal and beautiful all at once. He didn't pity her. He envied her. He drove home that night but didn't sleep. In his head, he replayed every word she said the day she was fired. "I don't need to be saved. I need to be respected." For the first time, he truly understood what she meant. Respect wasn't about titles or status. It was about seeing someone, really seeing them, for who they were beneath the noise of class and privilege. And so, the next morning, Adrian made a decision. Not as a CEO, but as a man who finally wanted to do something right. He returned to Pilsen the next day, this time in daylight. The neighborhood looked even poorer under the sun: peeling walls, children playing barefoot, an old man sweeping dust off his porch. Eliza was outside, tending to her wild patch of grass, her hands dirty, her clothes simple. He stood at the fence for a while before she noticed him. Her expression didn't change much. Maybe surprise, maybe guarded calm. But she didn't look angry. He told her he came not to apologize, but to offer something different. A proposal. A full-time position at Orion Global, $60,000 a year, flexible hours, full health insurance, not as charity, not as a favor, but as recognition of her skill. He explained that the role would allow her to work remotely part-time, to be there for Liam's treatments, to have stability, dignity, and choice. She listened quietly, arms crossed, her face unreadable. When he finished, she simply said, "I told you before. I don't want your pity." He shook his head. "It's not pity, it's respect." She said nothing for a long moment. The wind carried the sound of children laughing somewhere down the street. Then she asked softly, "And if I say no," he answered honestly, "then I'll still admire you." That made her pause. Something in her eyes softened. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but understanding. She didn't answer him that day. He left, unsure if she'd ever call. 2 days later, she did. Her voice on the phone was quiet, steady. "I'll take the job," she said, "for Liam's sake," but nothing more. He understood exactly what she meant. She was drawing a line, one he deserved. When Eliza returned to Orion Global, the whispers followed her like shadows. Some called it nepotism. Others called it charity. But she ignored them all. She went back to work with the same discipline as before, head down, hands steady, eyes sharp. And this time, Adrian didn't intervene. He didn't defend her. He didn't need to, because true respect doesn't need protection. It simply needs space to exist. At the end of her first week back, Adrian passed her in the hallway. She was holding a stack of translated documents, her pace brisk, her expression calm. For a moment, their eyes met. She gave him a small nod, nothing more, nothing less, and kept walking. And strangely, that tiny gesture meant more to him than any smile or thank you ever could. Because it wasn't gratitude, it was acknowledgement. A quiet promise that perhaps someday forgiveness might follow respect. That night, Adrian found himself driving again. Not to Pilsen, not to his penthouse, but to the river that split the city in two. He parked by the water, the skyline glimmering on the other side. He thought about the strange connection between wealth and loneliness. How the higher you climb, the fewer people you truly see. And then he thought of Eliza, of that little house with its broken paint and bright laughter. A place small enough to be forgotten, yet large enough to hold a kind of peace his money could never buy. He whispered into the dark, "You were right, Eliza. You didn't need saving. You just needed to be seen." And for the first time in years, Adrian Cole, the man who once measured everything in dollars, felt rich, not in power, not in success, but in the quiet realization that humanity was worth more than all the gold in his world. Sometimes we go looking for redemption in the wrong places, in grand gestures, in money, in titles. But redemption doesn't live there. It lives in the small houses, the quiet hearts, in the moments when we finally learn to see people not as statistics, but as stories. The Monday she came back, the entire building felt different. Not because anything had changed. The glass walls still gleamed, the elevators still sang their metallic hums, the suits still clicked down the marble floors, but because Eliza Torres had returned, and everyone knew it. When she walked through the lobby of Orion Global, heads turned. Whispers trailed her steps like perfume. Faint, poisonous, impossible to ignore. That's her, the cleaning lady who got the CEO fired up. Guess pity pays pretty well these days. The words didn't sting as much as they should have, because Eliza had learned long ago that people will always talk. And the moment you start defending yourself, you start losing your peace. So she walked, straight-backed, silent, untouchable. And though the air was thick with gossip, there was one person who said nothing, Adrian Cole. He simply stood at the top of the mezzanine, watching her across the lobby. No smile, no nod, just quiet acknowledgement. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Her first day back wasn't glamorous. The new office HR gave her was small, tucked beside the translation department. A plain desk, an aging monitor, and a window that overlooked nothing but a brick wall. Still, she greeted the space like an old friend. Because to her, work was work, and every honest job carried its own dignity. She started right away, reviewing old contracts and unfinished translations. No one offered to help. No one welcomed her back, but no one dared mock her face to face either. They whispered when she passed. They laughed behind closed doors. And still, she said nothing. 3 days later, a problem hit the company, the kind that could destroy months of negotiations in a single afternoon. A Japanese corporation, Miyamoto Industries, had sent over a major partnership agreement. It was crucial, a potential $12 million export deal that would expand Orion Global's reach into Asia. But there was a problem. The contract arrived entirely in Keigo, the most complex honorific form of Japanese business language, filled with idioms, double meanings, and context traps that even professional translators feared. The translation team panicked. Their software couldn't process it. Their lead translator misread several sections, accidentally changing clauses worth millions. Within hours, chaos spread across the top floor. Adrian was in his office when the department head knocked, face pale. "Sir, we have a serious issue. The Japanese deal. We can't finalize it." "Why?" Adrian asked. "The language is too complex. We can't find a reliable translator in time. The deadline's tonight." For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, without hesitation, he uttered one name. "Eliza." When she entered the boardroom, all eyes turned. The same executives who'd mocked her before, the same ones who whispered about Cinderella's promotion, now looked at her like a last resort. The head of the translation team cleared his throat. "This is delicate work," he said carefully. "Very technical." Eliza just nodded. "Then don't interrupt me." They slid the papers toward her, a thick stack of legal jargon written in Japanese calligraphy, fine enough to make most people dizzy. She sat down, pen in hand, eyes scanning line after line with calm precision. No hesitation, no panic. Just focus. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. At exactly 23 minutes, she set her pen down. "It's done." No one spoke. The head translator blinked in disbelief. "You finished?" She nodded. and corrected 3 major mistranslations. If you'd signed the original draft, Orion would have lost the export rights. The room fell silent. One of the executives checked her notes, scanning side by side with a digital translator, and gasped. She was right. Every correction she made saved the company millions. When Adrian walked in moments later, the room was frozen. Eliza stood by the window, sunlight spilling across her face while everyone else looked like they'd just witnessed a miracle. He didn't ask what happened. He could see it. The Japanese contract lay on the table, annotated in neat handwriting, every line marked with flawless logic and nuance. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The pity that once softened his gaze was gone. What replaced it was something rare for a man like him: admiration. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Respect between equals didn't require words. By the next morning, the news had spread across the entire building. The same mouths that once whispered against her now whispered about her genius. She solved a contract in 20 minutes? No way. Ask Cole. He saw it himself. The gossip changed tone, from mockery to awe, but Eliza didn't let it touch her. Praise, she knew, was as fleeting as ridicule. She kept her head down, her routine steady, her heart guarded, and yet somewhere deep inside she allowed herself a small breath of pride. Not because they finally saw her worth, but because she had never needed their approval to begin with. That week, Adrian called for an emergency executive meeting. The Japanese contract had been finalized, approved, and signed, thanks entirely to Eliza. Orion Global was about to enter its most profitable quarter in years. But when he took the stage to announce the success, he didn't mention numbers. He mentioned her. Without using her name, he told the story of a single employee whose quiet excellence saved this company from a costly mistake. He spoke about humility, talent, and the courage to speak less but mean more. Everyone in the room knew who he meant, and for once, no one dared to sneer. Because deep down they knew she had earned what none of them could fake: respect. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Adrian passed her office. She was still there, typing away under the yellow glow of her desk lamp. The same faded mug sat beside her, half filled with cold coffee. For a moment, he simply watched. It was strange, he thought, how someone could change the course of an empire and still go back to work as if nothing happened. He stepped inside quietly. She didn't look up. "You should go home," he said gently. "So should you," she replied, still typing. He smiled faintly. "Thank you for what you did." "You don't have to thank me. I just did my job." "No," he said. "You did more than that. You reminded me what real work looks like." She didn't respond. She just kept typing, eyes steady, fingers moving like they were writing her way out of history's shadows. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and in that brief silence, something passed between them. Not attraction, not apology, something rarer. Mutual respect, earned, not given. He left the office that night knowing one truth. He didn't save her reputation. She had saved his company and, in a way, his conscience. In the days that followed, the whispers faded completely. The building that once mocked her now moved around her with quiet reverence. People greeted her differently, with sincerity instead of suspicion. But Eliza didn't let it change her, because she knew what Adrian was only beginning to learn. Power fades, prestige decays, but character endures. They called her Cinderella when she returned. But Cinderella needed magic. Eliza Torres didn't. All she needed was time. Time to prove that dignity doesn't come from titles or money, but from doing what's right when no one believes you can. And on that day, in a boardroom full of power, the quietest woman in the room reminded them all what true greatness looks like. Some truths don't arrive with warning. They don't knock on the door politely. They crash through uninvited, like a storm that rips everything you thought was safe apart. For Adrian Cole, that storm began on a quiet Tuesday morning. The city was barely awake when his phone rang. He was halfway through a meeting, a $2 million deal, the kind of negotiation that used to define his life. when the words that would change everything came through the speaker. Mr. Cole, it's about Liam Torres. The name hit him like lightning. He didn't wait for details. He didn't ask permission. He simply stood up, left the room full of executives in stunned silence, and ran. Because at that moment, nothing mattered. Not money, not reputation, not even the deal that could double Orion Global's value. What mattered was a 7-year-old boy he barely knew, and the woman whose strength had redefined everything he thought he understood about dignity. At the hospital, the air smelled of antiseptic and fear. Machines hummed softly in the corner, their steady rhythm a cruel reminder that life hangs by threads too fragile to see. Eliza sat by her son's bed, holding his hand, whispering something he couldn't hear. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes fixed on the boy's chest, rising and falling under the white sheets. For the first time, Adrian saw her as more than the woman who'd saved his company. He saw her as a mother, terrified, exhausted, and yet somehow unbroken. The doctor explained that Liam had collapsed from extreme fatigue and dehydration. Nothing fatal, thank God, but it was a warning. Stress, long hours, inconsistent treatment. He needed stability. Eliza just nodded quietly, her fingers tightening around her son's. Adrian stayed there beside her, long after the doctor left. He didn't speak. He just sat. The silence between them filled with everything they couldn't say. And when she finally turned to him, her eyes held that same calm courage he'd come to recognize. The look of someone who'd already survived worse storms. You deserve to know, she said softly, before someone else tells you their version of the truth. Adrian frowned, unsure what she meant. Then for the first time, Eliza Torres told her story. Years ago, before Orion Global, before the blue uniform and the mop bucket, she had been one of the youngest diplomatic interpreters at Titan Holdings, a multinational finance conglomerate. She spoke 6 languages fluently and believed in the power of words, that communication could build bridges, that honesty could keep business clean. But what she discovered inside Titan was anything but clean. Buried inside translation drafts and client invoices were coded transactions. Money moved between shell companies, governments, and private accounts across continents. It was laundering, massive, international, untouchable. She didn't want to believe it at first, but the numbers didn't lie, so she did the one thing no one else had the courage to do. She reported it. She gathered the files, sent them to internal auditors, and thought she'd done the right thing. Instead, within a week, her access was revoked, her name erased from the system, and her face plastered on internal bulletins with a single word attached: traitor. They accused her of stealing data, falsifying reports, leaking classified information. The police never found evidence, but in corporate warfare, proof isn't necessary, only rumor. She was fired, blacklisted. Every company she applied to turned her away. And when she found out she was pregnant, abandoned by the man who once promised to protect her, she disappeared. 2 years later, she resurfaced, cleaning offices at night, raising her son by day. I wasn't hiding from the law, she said quietly. I was hiding from the world. Adrian sat frozen. He'd faced corruption before. Numbers, loopholes, politics, but never through the eyes of someone who had been its victim. You were punished, he said slowly, for doing what was right. She gave a faint, tired smile. The world doesn't always reward the right thing, Adrian. Sometimes it destroys it. Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't bitterness. It was truth. He wanted to tell her that she didn't deserve any of it, that she was the most honorable person he'd ever met, that the world should be ashamed for not seeing her worth. But he didn't, because words felt too small for the kind of courage she carried. Hours passed. Liam woke up, weak but smiling, whispering something about wanting ice cream. Eliza laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her in days. And for that brief moment, everything felt okay again. But peace has a cruel way of vanishing just when you start to trust it. The next morning, Adrian arrived at the office early. He barely had time to set his coffee down before his assistant burst through the door, pale and shaking. Sir, you need to see this. She slid her tablet across the desk. The headline burned like fire. Disgraced translator once fired for corporate fraud. now working inside Orion Global. Below it was a photo, Eliza in the hospital parking lot, holding her son's hand. Someone had followed them. Someone had dug up her past. Within minutes, the story was everywhere. Financial blogs, business news, social media. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted blood. Orion Global employs a convicted whistleblower. CEO's mysterious connection to ex-fraud suspect. Mother or manipulator? The comments were worse than the headlines. They tore her apart. Her appearance, her motherhood, her courage, twisting her truth into a spectacle for strangers. Adrian's phone exploded with calls. The board wanted answers. Investors threatened to pull funding. Clients paused contracts. In less than an hour, the empire he'd built began to crumble under the weight of a single story. But the worst part wasn't the chaos. It was the fear in her eyes when she walked into his office that afternoon. She knew. She'd seen the articles. Yet she stood there composed as ever. No tears, no outrage. "It's happening again," she said softly. "They found me." He rose from his chair. "We'll fight this. I'll call PR, lawyers." She shook her head. "You don't understand. The more you fight, the more they'll dig. And when they can't find new dirt, they'll create it." "You didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. "That's never mattered before," she replied. Her calm broke him more than her fear ever could. He wanted to stand between her and the world, to protect her from the lies. But she'd already lived through worse, and she knew how this story always ends. By evening, the boardroom filled with panic. Screens flashed with stock data plummeting. Reporters camped outside the building. The same executives who once applauded Eliza's brilliance now called her a liability. "We have to distance ourselves," James said. "The optics are catastrophic." "She's a convicted fraud," Richard added. "Even if she's innocent, perception is everything." Adrian slammed his hand on the table. "Perception doesn't make it true." Sandra, calm, deliberate, folded her arms. "Truth doesn't pay investors, Mr. Haitkenny Cole." The words hung in the air like poison. He realized then that the real corruption wasn't in Eliza's past. It was right there. In the fear, the greed, the cowardice that disguised itself as professionalism. But logic couldn't win this fight. By the time the meeting ended, the decision was clear. Orion Global would issue a statement. They would review Eliza Torres' employment. Corporate language for sacrifice her to save the brand. That night, Adrian sat alone in his office, the city lights bleeding through the glass. He thought about the woman who had saved his company, his reputation, and perhaps his soul, and how easily the world was ready to destroy her again. Downstairs, security footage showed her leaving quietly, hand in hand with Liam. No dramatics, no tears, just quiet resignation. She didn't even look back, because when you've lost everything once, you stop expecting the world to give it back. As she disappeared into the night, Adrian felt the walls of his empire closing in. The noise of the city blurred into one relentless echo. Money over morality, image over integrity. And for the first time in his life, the man who had everything realized he was completely powerless. Not because of the storm outside, but because of the silence of the woman who had chosen not to fight it this time. The world loves to punish the righteous, to turn truth into scandal and courage into shame. Eliza Torres had once risked everything to expose corruption, and now the world was doing what it does best, mistaking light for fire. But what no headline could ever print was this: she wasn't the one who needed saving anymore. Adrian Cole was, because for the first time, the man who built his empire on control finally learned what it meant to lose something worth more than power: respect. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from destruction. The stillness that follows when a man's entire world starts to collapse, and he realizes there's nothing left to hold on to but his own conscience. For Adrian Cole, that silence filled every floor of Orion Global. After the headlines, the company that once worshipped his every word now looked at him with suspicion. The boardrooms that used to echo with applause were now filled with whispers, the kind that destroy reputations faster than fire. And at the center of it all stood one name: Eliza Torres. Within 48 hours, the company's stocks fell 10%. Clients threatened to pull their contracts. Shareholders demanded action, and so the board called for an emergency meeting, one that would decide not just Eliza's fate, but Adrian's. The air inside that room felt heavy, almost suffocating. 12 people sat around a table that gleamed like ice. Their faces were masks, polite, composed, but cold. James Thornton, the CFO, spoke first. "We can't keep her, Adrian. The scandal is bleeding us dry. Every news outlet in Chicago is running the story." Sandra Liu, head of HR, added smoothly, "We've already drafted a formal statement. If you approve her dismissal by end of day, we can contain this." But Adrian said nothing. He just sat there, elbows on the table, hands folded, staring at the city skyline through the glass wall. They mistook his silence for hesitation. They didn't realize he was trying to stop his anger from turning into something worse. Finally, he spoke. "She did nothing wrong," James scoffed. "This isn't about wrong or right. It's about perception." "Then maybe perception is the problem," Adrian replied. "You're protecting a cleaning lady, Adrian," Sandra said, her voice low and careful, "while this company loses millions. Don't let your emotions destroy what you've built." He turned toward her, eyes sharp, voice calm. The kind of calm that comes before thunder. "If what I've built can't survive doing the right thing, then maybe it was never worth building." The room went still. But moral conviction doesn't win in corporate wars. Fear does. And fear, like infection, spreads quickly. Within the hour, a vote was called, 9-3, in favor of temporarily suspending Adrian Cole from his position as CEO, effective immediately. His assistant, pale and trembling, brought the paperwork for him to sign. He didn't even look at it. He just picked up the pen, scribbled his name, and handed it back. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You've protected your reputation. I hope you can sleep tonight." Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. He didn't take anything from his office. Not the awards, not the framed magazine covers, not even his nameplate. Just silence. Outside, the city felt colder than usual. The wind stung his face as he stepped into the street, his reflection flickering on the glass towers he once ruled. For years, he'd believed that power meant protection, that as long as he was strong enough, rich enough, feared enough, nothing could touch him. But now he knew better. Power protects no one when it stands against truth. Meanwhile, at a small apartment in Pilsen, Eliza Torres already knew what had happened. She didn't need a phone call. She didn't need confirmation. She could feel it, in the way the world suddenly grew too quiet. When she saw him at her doorstep that evening, she didn't even ask why he came, because his face said everything. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from watching something you love burn to the ground while you stand powerless to stop it. He told her the board had forced him out, that he'd refused to fire her, that he'd rather lose his title than let the world destroy another innocent person for telling the truth. For a long time, she said nothing, just stood there in the doorway, the evening light falling across her face. Then she whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." He frowned. "I couldn't do anything else. You just lost your company, Adrian. It's only money." "It's not," she said softly. "It's your life, your people, everything you've built." He shook his head. "Everything I built means nothing if I can't protect what's right." There was a pause, long enough to hear the distant hum of traffic, long enough to feel the weight of everything unsaid. Then she looked at him, her eyes glistening but steady. "You're losing everything because of me." "No," he said quietly, "because of who I've become because of you." And then came the truth neither of them had the strength to hide anymore. He stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Eliza." It wasn't a confession, it was surrender, from a man who had spent his life building walls, and was now finally brave enough to stand without them. But she didn't smile. Her eyes filled, but her expression stayed calm. The calm of someone who had learned that love doesn't always arrive at the right time. "I know," she said. "That's why I have to go." He froze. "Go? Where?" "Away, from here, from all this. You've already lost too much." "Then let me lose it," he said, "if it means keeping you safe." She shook her head. "That's not safety, Adrian. That's sacrifice. And I won't let you destroy yourself trying to redeem what the world broke in me. Her voice cracked for the first time. You gave me back my name. Don't lose yours for me. He tried to speak, to reach for her hand, but she stepped back. Her composure was quiet, but her pain was visible, like glass reflecting sunlight before it shatters. You can rebuild your empire, she whispered, but you can't rebuild your soul if you keep trading it for people like me. Then she smiled, that small, bittersweet smile he'd seen only once before, the kind that comes when strength and heartbreak share the same breath. Take care of yourself, Adrian. And with that, she closed the door. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the streetlights to flicker on, long enough for the sound of the city to drown out the sound of his own heartbeat. Behind the door, he could hear the faint sound of Liam's laughter, small, pure, untouched by the cruelty of adults. It was the sound of everything he'd lost and everything she was still fighting to protect. That night, Adrian didn't go home. He wandered the city, through empty streets, past the buildings that once bore his name, past the glass tower that now belonged to people who valued image over truth. Everywhere he looked, he saw reflections of himself, in windows, in puddles, in the faces of strangers. A man who had everything, a man who lost everything, and for the first time, a man who finally understood what it meant to have nothing and still be free. Because freedom doesn't come from power. It comes from choosing what's right, even when it costs you everything. Back at his penthouse, the silence returned, the kind that feels too heavy for walls to hold. He poured a glass of whiskey but never drank it. He just stood by the window, watching the lights of Chicago flicker like dying stars. Somewhere in that same city, a woman and her son were probably sitting down to dinner. Not rich, not safe, but together. And maybe that was what life was supposed to be. Not winning, not control, just connection. He smiled faintly, whispering to no one. You didn't destroy me, Eliza. You made me human. Love doesn't always save us. Sometimes it humbles us, breaks us, rebuilds us into something better. Adrian Cole lost his company, his power, his name, but he gained something the world could never give him, the courage to protect what was right, even when it walked away. Because real love doesn't chain, it frees. And real strength isn't measured in what you keep, but in what you're willing to lose for the truth. When truth finally wins, it doesn't shout. It stands quietly in the light while lies crumble on their own. 3 weeks after the trial, the world began to heal, and so did they. Titan Holdings, the empire that once silenced justice, fell hard and fast. The headlines that had once called Eliza Torres a fraud now screamed a different story. Titan admits guilt, whistleblower vindicated. Eliza Torres, the woman who stood against giants. The company was forced to issue a public apology and pay millions in restitution. Executives were arrested. Politicians distanced themselves from the scandal. And for the first time in a long time, the system did something right. But while the world praised her, Eliza stayed silent. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted peace. Adrian Cole watched it all unfold from the sidelines. He had lost everything once, his company, his name, his certainty. But watching Eliza rise from the ashes made him realize that some losses are the only way to make room for redemption. Then one morning, a letter arrived at his penthouse. The official seal of Orion Global stamped across the top. The board had voted. They wanted him back. The man they had suspended for moral recklessness was now being begged to return as the one who had been right all along. Adrian didn't smile when he read it. He just whispered to himself, "About time." But the first person he called wasn't the board. It was Eliza. When she opened the door that afternoon, the wind carried a different energy. It wasn't tension anymore. It was renewal. He told her he had been reinstated, but that wasn't why he came. He came to make her an offer, not a favor, not charity, an opportunity worthy of who she truly was. Director of International Relations, he said, his voice steady. 200,000 a year. Build your own team. Total independence. She looked at him, not with disbelief, but with quiet conflict. People will talk, she said finally. They'll say you're doing it because of me. He smiled. Let them talk. I've learned that when people can't understand your integrity, they'll always call it favoritism. She stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time in months, her eyes softened. You're serious. Deadly. And that was how the woman once called a janitor walked back into the tower she had once been thrown out of. Not as an employee, not as a translator, but as a leader. When she entered the lobby of Orion Global again, everyone stopped. Some looked in awe, some in shame, some in quiet admiration. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Because people who've walked through fire don't need applause to prove they've survived. Her first day back, she stepped into her new office, a corner space with a view of the skyline, the same city that had once looked down on her. She placed one thing on her desk, a photo of Liam smiling in front of their small house in Pilsen, and beside it, a folded piece of paper that read, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right anyway." Within months, Eliza transformed the department. She negotiated partnerships across continents, streamlined contracts, and rebuilt Orion's reputation through transparency and ethics, the same values that once cost her everything. And for the first time in years, Adrian watched his company thrive, not because of power, but because of principles. He often stood by the glass window, watching her lead meetings with quiet authority, remembering the woman who once mopped these very floors. And every time she spoke, he felt the same thing he had felt that first day. Respect, tinged with something deeper, something that could no longer be hidden behind professional lines. Then came the International Business Forum in Paris, a gathering of the world's top executives, ambassadors, and visionaries. Orion Global had been invited to speak, and Adrian insisted that Eliza be the one to represent them. When she stepped onto that grand stage, under the crystal chandeliers of the Palais Garnier, the audience rose before she even spoke. The same woman once silenced by scandal now stood before presidents, ministers, and billionaires. Not as a victim, but as a voice. Her speech wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. She spoke about integrity, how it's easy to stand tall when the world claps for you, but true character is measured when the world turns its back. She spoke about Liam, how her son taught her that resilience isn't inherited, it's learned. And she spoke about Adrian, without saying his name, about the man who reminded me that doing good doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. By the time she finished, the hall was silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted in applause that shook the chandeliers. That evening, during the gala dinner, Adrian stood on stage to deliver a closing toast. But instead of statistics or forecasts, he spoke from his heart. We live in a world obsessed with success, he began. But sometimes the truest success comes from failure, from losing everything and realizing what actually matters. He turned toward Eliza, his eyes warm but steady. I once met a woman who taught me that courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the strength to keep walking when you've been dragged through every lie, every doubt, every humiliation, and still choose to believe in decency. The audience followed his gaze. Every eye turned toward her. She looked down, embarrassed, smiling through tears. And then something happened that no one in the room expected. Adrian stepped off the stage, walked toward her, and right there, under the golden lights, surrounded by the world's most powerful people, he knelt. A diamond ring glimmered between his fingers. Eliza Torres, he said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. You taught me everything about integrity, about compassion, about what it means to be human, and I don't want to spend another day of this life without you. The hall gasped. Phones rose, cameras flashed. Reporters whispered, the CEO and the whistleblower, a modern fairy tale. But Eliza only laughed through her tears, shaking her head. You're insane, Adrian, she said softly. Ask me again when there are no cameras. The crowd laughed, clapped, cheered. And in that laughter there was no mockery, only joy. Later that night, after the lights dimmed and the music softened, they found themselves on the balcony overlooking the River Seine. Paris shimmered below, a city reborn with every reflection. He looked at her, still wearing that same humble smile that had once silenced entire boardrooms. You didn't say no, he whispered. I didn't say yes either. Then I'll take that as a maybe. She smiled again. You never give up, do you? Not on the right things, he said quietly. They stood there for a long time, not as CEO and employee, not as savior and survivor, but as two souls who had finally found balance. The city below glowed like gold, and for the first time, both of them believed that maybe happy endings weren't fairy tales after all. In the end, it wasn't power that redeemed them. It wasn't money or status or public praise. It was truth. The kind of truth that hurts, humbles, and heals all at once. Adrian Cole lost everything the world told him was valuable, but found something priceless in return. And Eliza Torres, the woman the world once called a scandal, became the proof that integrity doesn't need validation. It only needs time. Some stories don't end with a wedding. Some end with two people standing side by side, finally free, not because they conquered the world, but because they conquered themselves. 6 months later, the sky above Chicago looked different, clearer, calmer, as if even the wind had been waiting for this day. At the top of Orion Tower, where once decisions worth millions had been made in silence and fear, something completely different was happening. Something human, something beautiful. The rooftop had been transformed. Glass railings draped with white roses, strings of fairy lights floating like captured stars, and beneath them, two people who had once stood on opposite ends of the world now stood side by side, ready to begin again. It wasn't just a wedding, it was redemption in its purest form. Eliza Torres stood at the edge of the terrace, the city skyline behind her like a living painting. Her dress was simple, ivory silk, no diamonds, no glitter, just grace. Because real beauty doesn't need embellishment, it carries itself. Her son, Liam, now 8, stood proudly in a little gray suit beside Adrian Cole, holding the wedding bands. He was taller, stronger, his eyes brighter than ever. A child who had finally found stability and laughter again. He wasn't just a witness. He was proof that love, no matter how battered, can still build something whole. Guests filled the rooftop, friends, colleagues, reporters, and a few people who had once doubted every word that came from Eliza's mouth. But today, no one doubted. Today, no one whispered. Because today, they were there to celebrate something bigger than a wedding. They were there to celebrate courage. As the officiant began to speak, the wind swept gently across the terrace, carrying petals into the air. Adrian looked at her. This woman who had changed everything. The woman who had taught him that empathy is stronger than authority, and that respect once learned never leaves you. In that moment, he remembered the first time he saw her. A woman in a janitor's uniform standing in a boardroom full of arrogance, calmly saying, "I can translate it." She had translated much more than a letter that day. She had translated his entire understanding of humanity. And then, as if the day itself wanted to close a circle, 3 unexpected guests arrived, escorted by security, faces both nervous and remorseful. The former executives of Titan Holdings. They had asked to attend, not for publicity, but for forgiveness. The crowd turned as they approached, murmurs spreading like ripples. Adrian tensed, but Eliza's hand found his. Her fingers squeezed gently, a silent signal. It's okay. The eldest of the 3 men stepped forward. His hair was grayer now, his posture humbler. In his hand was an envelope, thick, sealed with a gold Titan insignia. "Ms. Torres," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "we came here not as businessmen, but as men who failed you." He paused, lowering his gaze. "Titan Holdings owes you a debt far greater than money, but this," he held out the envelope, "is what we can give. $2 million in reparations, personally authorized by the new board." Gasps rippled through the guests. But Eliza didn't flinch. She didn't even reach for it. She just looked at them, not with anger, but with a strange kind of peace. "You don't owe me anything," she said softly. "What matters isn't the apology. It's the courage it takes to make one." Her voice was calm, but the power in it made even the wind still. The men bowed their heads, grateful, maybe even lighter for the first time in years. That was Eliza's real gift. She didn't just win justice, She restored humanity to those who had lost it. As the ceremony resumed, Adrian's eyes stayed on her. He thought of all the times he had mistaken her quiet for weakness, of how she had walked through humiliation with her head held high, and how she had made him want to be better. Not richer, not stronger, just better. When the officiant finally said the words, "You may say your vows," he took her hands, and the city seemed to disappear. He didn't talk about destiny. He didn't talk about love at first sight. He just spoke the truth. "I once thought success meant never bending. That kindness was a weakness. You showed me I was wrong. You taught me that greatness isn't about power. It's about humility. And I promise that for as long as I live, I will never again look down on another human being, no matter who they are." Tears welled in her eyes, and then she smiled. That same quiet smile that had changed him years ago. "And I," she said, "promise to keep translating every word you say for the rest of your life, just to make sure you mean it." The crowd laughed, soft and warm, and the city lights blinked like applause. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the rooftop erupted in cheers. Petals rained down. Music rose. Even the sky seemed to glow a little brighter. Liam was the first to reach them, throwing his arms around both. His laughter echoed against the glass towers. Pure, fearless, free. It was the kind of sound that reminds you why people fight so hard to rebuild after everything falls apart. Later that night, under the canopy of stars and fairy lights, the celebration continued. People danced, toasted, and laughed. The same people who once represented the cold machinery of business, now clinking glasses to celebrate humanity instead of profit. And at the center of it all, Adrian and Eliza stood hand in hand, looking out over the city that had witnessed every chapter of their pain and redemption. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you ever think about how all of this began?" She smiled. "A translation worth $150,000. "No," he said softly, "a woman worth everything." As midnight approached, fireworks exploded over the skyline, bursts of gold and crimson lighting the night. The reflection shimmered in Eliza's eyes. She looked up, her face serene. It was strange, she thought, how once she had looked up at this same building from the street, a nameless woman with nothing but hope, and now she was standing on its highest floor, not as a dreamer looking in, but as someone who had found her place, not above others, just equal. Across the crowd, the former Titan executives approached once more, not to speak but to join the applause. Somewhere in that sound, redemption found its rhythm. Forgiveness had turned into music, and for once the city of ambition, the city that had taken so much from them both, gave something back, a second chance. It wasn't the million-dollar deals or the skyscrapers that defined them. It was the courage to fall and rise again, together. 6 years ago, Eliza Torres was invisible, a woman cleaning the floors of a world that refused to see her. Today, she stood above that same world, not to rule it, but to remind it what decency looks like. And Adrian Cole, the man who once believed success was measured in power, finally understood that the richest moment of his life wasn't when he gained everything, but when he chose to share it. Because in the end, love doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. As the music swelled and the city lights danced around them, Eliza turned to him and whispered the last words of the night, the words that would stay with him forever. "See? Sometimes the poorest heart saves the richest soul." And he smiled, knowing she had just translated the story of them both perfectly. Some stories end with love, others end with truth, but the rarest ones, the kind that stay in your heart long after the screen fades to black, end with purpose. For Eliza Torres, purpose came quietly, not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the faces of women who reminded her of who she used to be, the ones the world had forgotten. It began 3 months after the wedding. While the city still whispered about the rooftop miracle, Eliza was already working on something no one had asked for, something the world didn't even know it needed. She called it the Horizon Project, a nonprofit initiative dedicated to helping women who had been cast aside, single mothers, former janitors, immigrants, abuse survivors. Anyone who had once been invisible to the corporate towers that now bore her name. Her idea was simple: train them in languages, digital literacy, negotiation, skills that open doors, not charity, empowerment. Because Eliza had learned the hardest way that dignity doesn't come from handouts, it comes from opportunity. Every week she walked into a small converted floor inside Orient Tower, the same place where years ago she'd mopped tiles and carried buckets. Now it was filled with laughter, notebooks, and women who dared to dream again. She didn't stand at the front like a teacher. She sat among them, listening, sharing stories, laughing when someone mispronounced a phrase in English or cried over their first paycheck. When a reporter asked her why she started it, her answer was simple: because I remember what it felt like to be invisible. Now, I want to make sure no one else has to feel that way again. One afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the skyline, she stood by the tall glass window, the same view she had once only imagined from far below. From this height, the city looked small, but she never forgot how it felt to look up from the street, to see the same building and wonder what kind of people lived inside those lights. And so, with a quiet smile, she said to her assistant, "2 years ago, I was cleaning floors in this tower, wondering what was up there. Today I'm standing here, and it turns out, up here, they're just people too." The room laughed softly, but her eyes were serious. "The view doesn't change who you are," she added. "It only reminds you how far you've come." The Horizon project grew faster than anyone expected. Within months, it had partnerships with companies, universities, and embassies. Former housekeepers became translators. Single mothers became project managers. Women once terrified of interviews were now leading them. Every time a participant graduated, Eliza made it a rule to give them one thing: a silver key, engraved with the words, "You were never locked out. You just hadn't found your door yet." And each time when she handed one over, her hands trembled a little, because deep down, she knew she was still unlocking her own. One evening, she came home late. Adrian was waiting for her on the balcony of their apartment, the skyline glittering behind him, a glass of champagne in his hand. He turned as she walked in, smiling that quiet, knowing smile. "You worked late again." "It doesn't feel like work anymore," she said, kicking off her heels. "It feels like redemption." He crossed the distance between them, wrapping his arms gently around her shoulders. "You know," he said softly, "when I first saw you, I thought you were just a translator." She laughed. "You thought I was a janitor?" He smiled. "Even worse, I thought I was the one who was supposed to teach you something. Turns out, you were the lesson." Her laughter faded, replaced by that tender, peaceful silence they had both learned to love. Weeks later, a small press conference was held on the rooftop of Orient Tower, the same place where they had exchanged vows, the same sky that had witnessed their redemption. Reporters gathered as Eliza announced the expansion of the Horizon project across 3 cities. The audience clapped, cameras flashed, but she waited until the noise faded before she spoke again, her voice calm, reflective. "When I first came to this city, I used to look up at these towers and think the people inside had everything. I thought power was what made you seen." She paused, glancing out across the glittering skyline. "But I was wrong. Being seen isn't about standing higher. It's about standing for something. 2 years ago, I cleaned these floors. Today, I stand here not because I climbed higher, but because I refused to bow lower." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to listen. "This city once made me feel small. But I learned that dignity doesn't come from where you stand. It comes from what you stand for." Her words lingered in the air long after she stepped down from the podium. Later, when the reporters had gone, she stayed behind. The rooftop was quiet again, just her, the wind, and the memory of who she once was. She leaned against the railing, eyes tracing the horizon. The city lights shimmered below, the same streets where she had once walked home with sore feet and a paper bag of groceries she could barely afford. And for the first time, she didn't feel bitterness. She felt gratitude. Because if not for those nights, she would never have known what real strength felt like. Adrian joined her, sliding an arm around her waist. They stood there together. 2 survivors, 2 dreamers, Two people who had learned that love and respect can rebuild what ambition destroys. She turned to him and said softly, "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I used to think people at the top of these buildings were the owners of the world. Now I realize ownership isn't about money or title. It's about conscience." He smiled, pulling her closer. "You were always the owner, Eliza. I just took too long to see it." She rested her head against his chest. The night hummed softly around them, the sound of cars below, the whisper of the wind through the railings, the heartbeat of a city that had finally learned her name. Once she was invisible, a nameless woman cleaning the footprints of those who thought they were better. But fate has a strange way of rewarding the ones who never stop believing in decency. Eliza Torres became more than a survivor. She became a mirror, showing the world that power means nothing without empathy, and that the smallest act of courage can echo louder than the tallest skyscraper. And Adrian Cole, the man who once measured life in profit and prestige, learned the one truth money could never buy: that real worth isn't what you own, it's what you protect. As the lights of Chicago shimmered beneath them, Eliza whispered one final thought. Not for anyone to hear, but for herself and for every woman who had ever felt unseen. "I was once the invisible one, but now I see them all. And somewhere deep below, the city that had once looked down on her finally looked up to the woman who taught it how to stand tall."